The 3200G is definitely an interesting piece of hardware, and I don't think I would be doing it much justice if I didn't go a little more in depth with just how well it does with emulation. Before I get into testing, here are the specs for the 3200G build. Beginning with the third generation console, I decided to start with the Nintendo Messen emulator. Messen is a demanding emulator because it focuses on accuracy, and so I thought it would be interesting to see just how far I could push games on this emulator. As you may have already guessed, games run fine on this emulator even when using upscaling to higher resolutions, but that is just where things begin. Messen also utilizes the run-ahead feature to improve input delay, and turning it on does by no means bring the 3200G to its knees. The only thing left to test out was some overclocking on the emulated CPU, and like everything else, no problem here. Moving on to the fourth generation, I tried out the BSNES Super Nintendo emulator. BSNES is another accurate emulator that has been adding some quality of life features, with the biggest one being an HD upscale for games that took advantage of the system's Mode 7 technology. This, along with the run-ahead option, which is also available with this emulator, definitely puts the 3200G through its paces. So much so I had to change the API to DirectX 9 to ensure the games ran at their intended frame rate. Overclocking is possible with the other enhancements as well, which definitely makes for a great experience with titles that put some stress on the original hardware. From here we go to the fifth generation of gaming, and there's definitely a lot to explore here. For starters, I figured I would try out some 3D accelerated arcade titles, as they can be very demanding when it comes to emulation. I first tested Virtual Racing, a Sega Model 1 arcade title, which is now fully emulated on MAME, and the game ran fantastic. Same went for the Sega Model 2's hardware as well on the Model 2 emulator. I even tried out Capcom's ZN1 hardware with the Zinc emulator, and no issue there either. While it's amazing to enjoy 3D games on some emulated arcade hardware, I of course can't ignore the consoles of this era either. Let's start with the popular PlayStation 1 console using the RetroArch Beetle HW core. I just so happened to build this PC only weeks after a new update added a dynamic recompiler, which now allows for higher performance with lower end machines. Funny enough, there was really no need to use this feature as the 3200G handles upscaling and overclocking pretty well. Of course, if you do want to double your frame rates, then the dynamic recompiler is definitely going to be necessary, as I did run into some demanding areas where the frame rate did drop. The 3200G also handles the performance-heavy Sega Saturn Beetle core with no real effort, as I saw titles like Burning Rangers running so fast that I had to limit the speed in order to get the game to run at a proper frame rate. I did go over some 6th generation titles during the initial review of the HTPC, but there are a few things that I had yet to really test in depth. I left out Dreamcast emulation in the review, as the 3200G has more than enough power to handle the emulation at high frame rates, but there was one title in particular I wanted to try on the Flycast RetroArch emulator core. Phantasy Star Online originally ran at 30 frames per second, but the Flycast emulator can double the frame rate of this title, and so I wanted to see how well the 3200G would do. It has been so far so good during initial tests, but I had yet to hit a really truly demanding area where enemy spawns can certainly start to drop the frame rate, so just keep this in mind. I also did not get a chance to showcase some GameCube titles using the Dolphin emulator, where I did attempt to do a few enhancements outside of upscaling. From the few games I tested, 16 times anisotropic filtering doesn't have much bearing on the hardware, and MSAA seems to float between 2 times and 4 times, depending on the title you choose. Next, we'll move to the PCSX emulator, where I once again took some time to try some extra feature enhancements to see just how far I could push the emulator at the 1080p resolution. In this case, there are a lot of factors that determine how far you can go with enhancements. If you can't take advantage of the multi-core CPU option, you are most likely looking at just an upscale, but like the Dolphin emulator, 16 times anisotropic filtering is fine with additional FXAA in some cases. From here, I headed back to the Dolphin emulator, taking a look at the Wii titles, and surprisingly, the results are pretty much the same as the GameCube. Going into the 7th generation of titles is where we finally see the 3200 meet its inevitable match. The Wii emulator CMU is definitely not as hard on the 3200 in terms of performance. Almost every title I tested ran at its intended frame rate. I definitely have to give credit where credit is due, and the CMU has proven to be the most optimized out of the available emulators in this generation. As I mentioned in the previous video, the PS3 emulator RPSC3 is basically a no-go, and so it's here that I have to unfortunately end this video. Overall, the 3200G is definitely recommended for emulation, especially if you're looking to keep it under $500. I do plan to add a dedicated GPU in the future, and when I do, you can bet I'll be back with another video. For now, this is The Core, your resident entertainment techie, signing out.